In the average day, there are 350 million tweets sent in the entire world. That's approximately, fun fact, 350 million more tweets than were sent in 1751. Let's talk about that. Hey there, my name is Mr. Ridgway and welcome to an AP edition of Ridgway History. So today we're going to be looking at industrialization and then critiques of the industrial system. So as we move on here to Unit 5, you're going to start seeing that things are happening and there's lots of changes going on. And in fact, things are changing so radically that you're going to see that as things are really developing in the world system, that there's some critiques that happen with that. And so today, aptly worn, I have my rebellious t-shirt because as you're going to see, there's some people like Mr. Karl Marx who have some very interesting critiques of this thing called industrialization and what happens. So today you're going to be able to, by the end of this lecture, we're going to look at industrialization, like what that is, and then how it impacts everyday people, and then we're also going to explore critiques of these capitalist systems in several different regions around the world by looking at several different examples of people, such as Mr. Karl Marx over here on the right hand side. Industrialization and its critics. A couple of essential questions to guide you just like normal. So is industrialization the only way to become modern? You're going to find that how historians define the word modern is really controversial, and people have a lot of feelings, and probably appropriately so, because there's lots of versions in the world of what we mean by that things are modern. Then second, does industrialization result in better or worse outcomes for everyday people? Again, you're going to find this is really controversial because lots of people have lots of different feels on how this comes about. So, okay, let's move on to what the heck is this word that I'm saying that's like 6 syllables and seems super complex. So what is industrialization? It's kind of hard to define because it's easier to point to examples of industrialization than actually really define than say exactly what it is. But if you had to go with one definition, it's really the integration of everything with everything. You probably have no idea what that means. So let me give you an example. Industrialization is really the reference to developments of transportation and how that combines with urbanization, people moving to cities, and then developments in medicine like the discovery of germs by Louis Pasteur, the developments of factories for the first time, assembly lines, the 9-to-5 job. It's everything coming together with everything and merging together. And really, industrialization is all of this happening all at once. And if that sounds chaotic, it's because it was. Industrialization is crazy in terms of how far human beings have progressed in the past 250 years. I mean, we've gone all the way from sending 0 tweets in 1750 to 350 million in basically one day. And that process really is industrialization. Now again, you have to be careful here because some historians think of a lot of historians again assume that industrialization is a form of progress, but it's how we define that progress that's come about that's really important and has a whole load of controversy with it. Industrialization, there's a couple really key important parts that as you work through your readings and work through your chapters and we work through all this content that you have to keep in mind. First of all, industrialization usually has some kind of relationship with greater job specialization, meaning that peoples and companies begin focusing on doing one thing but a lot better. For example, we have the Carnegie Steel Company in the US, and by their name, that's really what they focus upon, is being a really good, well, monocle, steel company in the United States. But there's also other things too that are really important. So industrialization also means that people start moving to cities. And for the first time, definitely in the 20th century, more than 50% of the population actually is what we call now urban. It's even higher now. However, there's also some controversial things with that as well. That for example, money, the power of money, your economic, basically what's in your wallet, starts to replace the power of what has traditionally been your status or what you were born into, or this idea of being an aristocrat. You typically find that money can be a ticket into becoming part of that upper echelon of society. And that's again another really important part of industrialization. You can look at lots of different examples of this in practice. So for example, with this whole term that we use now called the middle class starts coming about, as well as other really, really important things like corporations and stocks. So again, industrialization, and there's probably those big three things you can keep in mind, is its greater specialization, greater urbanization, and then pretty much the power of money begins, not totally, to replace the power of status. So industrialization results in so many things today. Railroads, the idea of like having interchangeable parts. So on like an iPhone, if you break your screen, you can go to a factory or you can go to a shop and they can replace your screen with an exactly identical part that will fit your particular tool. And that concept didn't used to exist before. Factories, like 9 to 5 jobs, canals, railroads, museums, parks, the assembly line, hospitals, newspapers, unions. It's just, apartments, wages. There's so much stuff that comes out of industrialization that we just assume is part of normal life today, but wasn't about 1750 or even before then. So again, industrialization's huge, it's transformative, there's lots of changes going on, and it's the reason why we're able to have lots of the things that we can do today. It's so big and so powerful. But with that power, and as you find and as you look through your chapter readings, the role of industrialization in people's lives doesn't come without controversy. Because as you find with any kind of transformative change that happens, change can be good for some people, but it can also result in really bad things happening. So like when I asked you on like essential question number 2, does industrialization result in better or worse outcomes for everyday people? There's a lot of really different opinions on that. And one of those guys' opinions who says that this is not such a good idea, you're going to see here, is a man by the name of Karl Marx. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Before we get to that, there are some problems with industrialization. First, it's really, really messy and very unorganized. There's nobody like driving, quote unquote, the car of industrialization. Nobody's in charge. Again, it's everywhere, everything happening all at once. And so like an example of like how industrialization goes bad is, for example, like the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory, which was a fire in New York that happened in the late 19th, I think it was late 19th or early 20th century. And there were a bunch of ladies working inside a shirtwaist factory, and there were not proper fire codes for this building. And a fire broke out, and lots of them died. And so, like industrialization, you have people working in factory jobs, but there aren't standards set up for how, how codes and, like safety codes and those kind of things that we assume are just there today, like the concept of fire drills. There's also really ugly things like child labor. So like, 8-year-olds or 14-year-olds going to go work in factories, and then they come out of these, factories or mining jobs, and they have just like terribly mangled hands from getting their hands stuck in machines. Hey, don't Google pictures of it. Other than that, there's, cities, like when, urbanization, we talked about 50% of the population is now in the cities. Like cities at first are exceptionally dirty, like rats, plumbing isn't installed in lots of buildings. You have like families, living in very, very tiny homes, and it's very, very unorganized and chaotic. So with that, industrialization also doesn't apply equally to everywhere. As men or as certain segments of the population get the benefits of industrialization, other places and other people do not. In the United States, one of the issues that many historians have pointed towards that led towards the Civil War is that the North became increasingly industrialized as the South became increasingly agrarian, and that difference caused problems. So it doesn't apply equally everywhere. But then also, like, women and minorities don't, reap as many of the benefits that some of, like, for example, white men do in other contexts. But also, and as you're going to see here with our man Karl Marx, there's a lot of really big social class differences that happen during industrialization as well. So like the differences of people like having certain money compared to others. And that is where Karl Marx and a few other critiques emerge of industrialization. Now Karl Marx is not the only person to come out and be a critique of industrialization and also this thing called capitalism. But he is one that I really want to discuss because his ideas have become incredibly controversial, and the comment section on YouTube will just run away with them. However, if you want to know Karl Marx, and we're going to look at the historical part of him here, Karl Marx was a German, not Russian, political philosopher. Now, besides being from the best country in the world, which is, of course, Germany, Uh, Karl Marx exemplified really a greater critique of social problems that emerged out of industrialization. Again, he's not the only guy. There's lots of people that go on and try to find or found things like utopia, which is a really, really cool study. If you ever heard of New Harmony, Indiana, that's a really, really close local utopia that was founded by people here during industrialization and capitalism. But Marx is probably the best known of them. And what Marx proposed was a counter to capitalism, or the capitalist system called socialism. So if you had to define capitalism, we've kind of looked at it before a little bit with mercantilism, but what capitalism is, and what I guess it is today, is an economic system where private goods are sold for profit. And they're sold for profit in this imaginary thing that we call the market. So capitalism really relies upon private individuals going out and selling goods that they make and then selling them again to make profit. Now, Marx saw this as a problem. I love his beard, by the way. That's a phenomenal beard. So what Marx said, okay, and his ideas became pretty widespread as the 18th century goes on, is that inequality, people being unequal in terms of social classes, came from differences in ownership of what he called the means of production. What the means of production are is like, I have no idea what that means. That doesn't actually, you said something, but it doesn't mean anything. The means of production are simply people's abilities to make goods. So, like having ownership of a factory, or your own labor is considered to be a means of production, because what you spend time doing actually results in you making something, as well as like your ability to own supplies or natural resources, like oil or coal. And so what he says is that problems happen because people have different levels of ownership of these things. Now, Marx, basically, if we take that view and then we think about it like long term, is he said that history really is just like all of history, all of human history is just economic conflict over the means of production. And in the current times that Marx was writing in 19th century, he says this is a conflict between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. It's simply a fancy word for upper and lower classes. So the bourgeoisie own the means of production, the proletariat doesn't. What Marx again said is, so he said that world history had actually moved through stages. And you don't need to write these stages down, but because I'm a nerd, I thought you might be interested to find out what they are. So he says that originally human beings started out in something called, basically this thing called primitive communism, which is like kind of like Native Americans, okay? Communism, nobody owns any goods, you don't have conflicts between proletariats and bourgeoisie classes, and it moves on. But then what Marx says is you have a series of conflicts throughout world history between those who own the means of production and those who do not. So he says, like the first stage, slavery, is between slave owners and slaves. And then the system, they conflict, and it moves on to the next stage. So then that's feudalism. You have landowners, lords who own the land, and then serfs who work the land but don't actually own it. Again, there's a conflict, there's rebellion, and then you get the next system, which is where Marx was actually writing in, and that's called capitalism. And so Marx then says there's this conflict between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. However, what Marx proposed and what was so controversial is that he said the proletariat would become so frustrated that they did not own these means of production that there would be basically a proletariat revolution, which is again why this was so controversial, because some people became really scared that this could actually happen. However, Marx saw capitalism as a necessary stage in order for what he saw as the next stage of economic history. He says once the proletariat rises up, you get this thing called socialism, which is where you get kind of like managers of the state and then workers. But once that kind of proceeds through its stages, you get this thing called communism. Communism is really, really important for a whole host of reasons. Number one, communism obviously is really, really scary for a capitalist system. Because in communism, if there's no such conflict between the proletariat and the bourgeoisie, and everybody really has ownership of the means of production, that means that people aren't concerned with making profit, which again scares lots of businesses and corporations from that idea. However, communism has, and I think rightly so, been criticized because it doesn't really take into account necessarily human nature, and that is that human beings tend to be a little greedy, and we like to have things in our own personal possessions. But in communism, just as like really, really early primitive communism, there's no private property, and that's kind of a hard thing to rectify when you look at human nature. But the goal of communism, and of course what Marx said, is that there's no struggle for what people need anymore because each person gets what they need according to their ability. And again, Marx comes under a lot of criticism for this, and probably rightly so, because he doesn't take into account a lot of human things, meaning like, for example, if you're not going to make profit, what motivation is there for you to try to expand or come up with innovative things? So again, there's really a lot of controversy about what Marx says. However, people take his ideas, such as well, soon upcoming Vladimir Lenin in Russia, and try to make this actually work in practice, and pretty much fail miserably. However, this Karl Marx's ideas do go on and inform lots of other things, like how people think about human relationships, and how historians interpret history, and then how, for example, governments should take care of their people. And those ideas get replicated and passed down and filter into all sorts of things about how people think about the world differently. In fact, there's like whole themes in literature now that are dedicated to how can we study this from a Marxist point of view, which is looking at social classes and economics. Again, there's lots of important things that are transformative in terms of what's going on in terms of the world, but capitalism and industrialization doesn't come without its critics. So that's pretty much it for this episode of Ridgway History. Best of luck filling out those note outlines, and I will see you next time in class. Bye-bye!